The issues of epistemology, power, and identity serve as potential levers for changing Indigenous teacher preparation. During the next half hour, we will describe how these three themes have influenced Indigenous education as well as Indigenous teacher preparation by looking at 5 program examples from 4 countries. We begin by hearing from Aboriginal educators and community members in Australia about who they are and their role in Indigenous education.
The thing I like about my job as a teacher, that I can walk out of there and become a community member, you know, but that's too, and I can be a community member. I can be a sister, an auntie, a mother, a grandmother. I can be all of those things. But when I walk into that classroom, I'm actually a teacher. I'm actually an educator. But everything that makes me that educator is what I take into that class.
I'm Hannah McGlade. I'm a Noongar woman. I'm from Perth, and I have a background in law and human rights. I wanted to become involved just to talk to Aboriginal kids about how important education is.
An Aboriginal teacher, you can be a leader as well within your community and within the school as well, and you actually, as a teacher, have that ability to have a very powerful voice within that community and be able to help shape that school environment and that community in a way that is more, friendly and, culturally safe.
You do have a lot of power in the classroom and what you say and do and teach, and just knowing that you're an agent for change is a special thing.
I'm Tiger Bales. I'm CEO of the Brisbane Indigenous Media Association, based in Brisbane. And I'm of the Wiri clan of the Birri Nation, as well as Kungaloo people, and Waka Waka people, and Willy Willy people. A good education, a meaningful education, provides people with opportunities for later in life. It prepares them for later in life. It's an investment in the individual.
At its most basic level, Indigenous education is a human rights issue. Indigenous peoples from New Zealand to Alaska have been oppressed and exploited for over 500 years. They have been displaced from their lands, physically annihilated, and their knowledge has been deemed superstitious by a globally dominant epistemology that claims singular and universal truths. Indigenous education is one of the principal keys to cultural and political self-determination for Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, successful and culturally affirming Indigenous education may have broader implications for non-Indigenous societies and the linguistic, cultural, and biodiversity of the entire planet. So far, Western science and modern technology have not been able to provide comprehensive solutions to worsening environmental degradation and global climate change. As we edge closer to environmental crises, in many circles it is hoped that Indigenous knowledge may work together with Western science in order to offer the entire planet innovative and dynamic new ways of thinking about the world we live in.
Our cycle here is in a strange situation now with climate change. The flow that our ancestors had become accustomed to is changing. So even now the geese are confused. Do we go? Do we stay? The fish, I understand, are running out of order. The maple sap starts flowing and shuts down flow. So as nature becomes confused, we hope that that core Indigenous knowledge that we learned from countless experiences in the past will help us help the earth to get back into its pattern.
Indigenous teacher education is a crucial element in Indigenous people's struggles for self-determination and a culturally responsive education. But before we analyze Indigenous education and teacher training, it's important to develop a basic understanding of traditional Indigenous epistemologies and knowledge systems.
Every people, all the cultures of the world, come from a place. And in that place, all people are coming into the world, and then they come to learn. And they learn from the knowledges that begin within a particular place. And that place defines for a group of people what it is, how they relate to the world, how they relate to each other, and how they're going to survive and live within that particular place.
It is difficult to provide a brief explanation of what is Indigenous knowledge, precisely because every Indigenous population has their own knowledge system. Today, some aspects of Indigenous knowledges have been lost or are dormant and waiting to be renewed. Although generalizing on Indigenous knowledge might be interpreted as a disservice to diverse groups of people, we find it helpful to discern similarities. In the context of university teacher education programs in which teacher educators may be teaching students from a number of different tribes, the ability to understand and articulate some general principles of Indigenous knowledge may be extremely important in both developing better relationships with Indigenous pre-service teachers and in developing culturally sensitive pedagogies. Here are three important aspects of Indigenous knowledge. In Western University's teacher education program, teacher candidates and instructors were planning a plant growth activity in which students would measure and record the growth of plants when different types of seeds are planted in different soils. Here, one Indigenous teacher candidate responds to the lesson plan.
I'd not normally have them do it this way. You can look at it and know it's growing. You don't need a ruler for that. And we wouldn't plant it in sand anyway. Things don't grow well in sand, and everyone knows that. We plant the bean where we always do. But with No Child Left Behind and other testing, I'd have to do it this way anyway, or at least I'd have to teach them how to read a ruler and be ready for the test.
As the previous story demonstrates, science in Eurocentric schools is often decontextualized and can be confounding for both Indigenous children and teachers. The scientific method imagines the investigator as a neutral observer instead of an involved and active participant in knowledge production. Indigenous knowledge often does not value objectivity as a positive thing. While Indigenous peoples do not claim universal truths, they do believe in truth based on their experiences and relationships in a specific place. For Indigenous peoples, knowledge is based on a long history of experiences and relationships between people, land, and animals in a specific context. Education worked as a life-sustaining process that unfolded through reciprocal relationships between one social group and the natural world. In this context, there may not be clear delineations between subject and object. Animals, plants, and even rocks are beings that interact and form relations with humans. To illustrate this point, the words bear and tree in Anishinaabe most accurately translate as bear person or tree person in English. These types of relationships are often not validated in Eurocentric public schools.
That the earth holds the knowledge, that the rocks hold the knowledge, the trees, and all of that stuff, because it has witnessed all of those generations. It's heard all of the speeches and songs and heard all of the ceremonies, so it captures the essence of what people in that place are trying to express and then inspires people to express that. So it's a reciprocal relationship between the humans and the place.
Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars often refer to Indigenous knowledge as knowledge systems. In a traditional Indigenous knowledge system, there is a big picture, unified worldview without compartmentalization of knowledges. There is no separation of science and religion, which means that values and morals are deeply integrated into education. Learning is considered to be a way of coming to know about life. In its long history, the schooling process for Indigenous peoples has been based on a hierarchy of knowledge in which Indigenous knowledges are framed as deficient. Teachers have historically been frontline actors in attempts to assimilate Indigenous peoples.
Hace 20-25 años, las comunidades lucharon para tener una escuela. Ellos han creído que les iba a mejorar muchos aspectos, ¿no? Realmente iba a mejorar incluso su vida, algo así. Pero que como ahora en la comunidad han visto y no les ha mejorado, al contrario, les ha traído, por ejemplo, pérdida de valores, ya no hay respeto y entre otras cosas, y un padre de familia lo va a decir, y yo mismo lo digo de repente, ¿no?
At school, Indigenous children are confronted with daily assaults on their traditional beliefs and ways of being.
La educación es uno de los principales mecanismos de reproducción de los discursos que legitiman desigualdades y diferencias en el país. La escuela es uno de los elementos de violencia más fuertes en el país en contra de las poblaciones indígenas y específicamente en contra de los niños. Niños que en el hogar han aprendido a hablar quechua o aymara en el sur andino durante 3, 4 años, tienen que de pronto verse enfrentados a un aparato de educación que hace invisible absolutamente esa experiencia de educación previa en el hogar. Los maestros, muchos de ellos indígenas, se ven obligados también a enseñar a esos niños con un régimen, con una forma de razonamiento, con una forma de pensar, con una forma de vincularse con el entorno natural, con la geografía, con las maneras de comprender el mundo que no corresponden a las culturas de las cuales estos niños provienen.
The vitality of Indigenous peoples and their respective knowledge systems are greatly varied amongst different groups across the globe. Although there are a few examples of Indigenous peoples who are thriving, all of them face great challenges in recuperating and revitalizing their knowledges. It is important to note that while revitalization does not entail a return to the past, it does seek to adapt traditional knowledge and ways of knowing to contemporary contexts. Power, epistemology, and identity are central to Indigenous education. Indigenous epistemologies should be valued as equally as Western epistemologies. Indigenous communities should have power to influence and construct the education of their children as a way to strengthen and revitalize their cultural identity.
It's important to recognise our culture, to know who we are and where we come from, and encourage and promote identity and culture.
It's about showing our children that they can be in a school space and that there is a nurturing of them and a caring of them in regards to their Aboriginal identity and also their knowledge systems.
Que si es que ese niño se va a formarse dentro de eso, con ese cimiento, con esa base, el niño nunca va a olvidar lo que es. Será un ingeniero, siempre va a decir mi procedencia es tal, me he educado así. Yo sé servirme a los sapos, sé agradecer a la Pachamama, como también sé manejar computadoras, sé manejar auto, tengo mi casa, ¿no? Eso es. Entonces fortalecer la identidad, sin menospreciar su cultura.
That is deep core knowledge that needs to be brought to the surface, needs to be brought not just to Aboriginal people where they have lost it because of the Indian residential schools, but more importantly, it's a way of how we are going to live in the future together. It's about how do we restore and renew the very core of our being, of what it means to be an Indigenous humanity.
Si podemos hablar profesionales, pero que no olvidan sus culturas andinas, que es nuestra causa en el campo, ¿ya? Entonces, con el estudio, bueno, con la educación, con nuestras costumbres, no tiene que separarse, juntos tiene que haber. Entonces, para defender, para hablar, bueno, para anunciar nuestra costumbre, tiene que haber juntos.
As an Aboriginal person, I'm able to live and to to work in a variety of different contexts and change and adapt and grow and evolve and live my culture, but also walk the way of the white man, you know, and speak in traditional language, but also speak in fluent English and write and read and actually speak for my people from an educated background and a passionate background as well. And it's been good to actually watch people listen to what I have to say.
Indigenous teachers themselves are often products of assimilatory education systems. In light of this, there is a need for a decolonizing framework in developing teachers to serve Indigenous students.
Nosotros somos culpables porque hemos ido destruyendo las comunidades y toda la riqueza de todo el Perú. Y la riqueza está en todas estas comunidades. Nosotros hemos destruido. Yo les pediría a todos los profesores del Perú, de las zonas rurales, de los lugares más alejados, de las comunidades más olvidadas, que sean ellos los primeros en retomar, a regresar a esa vivencia, en recordar primero de repente sus primeros días de vida, porque muchos profesores, a pesar de haber sido indios, hoy queremos aparentar ser mistis, y no es así.
In 2005, the Chiefs of Ontario stated that a foundational element of high-quality First Nations education system is the presence of teachers and educators who understand First Nations history, culture, intellectual traditions, and language. They must also comprehend First Nations relationships with land and creation. As mentioned previously, three main themes of tension in the development of Indigenous teacher educators who can positively contribute to their community's cultural and linguistic health are power, epistemology, and identity. These are themes that we found to be common in analyzing Indigenous teacher education programs. Perhaps there is an inherent conflict between the goal of Indigenous self-determination and the sovereignty of the post-colonial nation-state. Governments have continuously sought to control the narrative of Indigenous education. Even in countries such as New Zealand, Peru, and Bolivia, where governments have passed multiple laws and education reforms in favor of multicultural Indigenous education, there are problems of top-down implementation of reforms, government co-option of autonomous community initiatives, and lip service contributes to a continued process of assimilation through education. Gordon Burns and Campbell refer to the fallacy of biculturalism, which means that while frequently Indigenous students are required to participate in bilingual and bicultural education programs, members of the dominant society are not required to learn an Indigenous language, nor do they necessarily learn about the culture of their Indigenous counterparts. Of course, there are funding issues as well. One Indigenous author expresses her concern that as long as Indigenous teacher education programs are dependent on short-term competitive government grants, as many are in the United States and Canada, there will always be a shortage of Indigenous teachers. Universities play a role of the gatekeeper in determining what knowledge and whose knowledge is considered valuable. For Indigenous peoples, the university represents an authoritative power that has routinely discarded their knowledge and justified their oppression. Many university teacher educators do not know much about Indigenous cultures and knowledge systems, and are therefore unable to model the type of pedagogies that are culturally appropriate for Indigenous teacher candidates. In the United States and Canada, Indigenous teacher educator programs are often housed within a one-size-fits-all program, offering one or two courses that are relevant to Indigenous education. These three factors contribute to what Frank Deere refers to as tokenistic pedagogies that focus on arts and crafts, song and dance, and neglect deep and systematic changes in pedagogy. Many Native teachers are products of assimilatory education systems and find themselves caught between two worlds. Therefore, before being able to teach using Indigenous pedagogies, candidates must go through a process called decolonization of the mind. Yet through this process, some Indigenous teacher candidates rightfully criticize that there is too much focus on an idealized past with a need to increase attention to contemporary issues and struggles. Traditional knowledge from the past is made useful when applied to contemporary times and dilemmas. Lastly, the loss of language is an enormous hurdle for some communities that have very few or no living speakers. Some scholars question whether it is possible to revitalize Indigenous knowledge and culture without having access to language.
Very basically learned about, and most of it is very dominant First Nation, which a lot of people make a synonym for Aboriginal, but they tend to forget about the Métis and Inuit people as well.
Which is you.
Which is me, yeah. So that's found a big issue in the school systems, definitely. Of course, First Nation are very important. Being a Métis person, I wouldn't be Métis if I didn't have First Nation blood. So of course, that's a huge part, and I definitely respect learning about all the different cultures. But I think there needs to be more of a focus on Métis and Inuit people as well, and to make sure they're always included.
And they haven't been in your experience?
No. It's mostly learned about the medicine wheel. That was the big thing of the grade 10 Native Studies course I took.
Did you ever talk to the teachers about why their knowledge of all of this is so minimal? I mean, it's not their fault, presumably. They haven't been educated.
I brought it up to my one teacher, and she said that all the teachers had to do a workshop, but it was like a one-day workshop, and then that's it, you're done, go teach. So it was very quick, like this is the medicine wheel, here's some pamphlets, here's how you do it, and go teach it. So I don't feel like they get enough education, and that's why I feel like teachers, when you're in Teachers College, you should be taking Native Studies courses, so you get that basic knowledge as you're going to become a teacher, so when you get to that point, you're not doing a one-day workshop and expected to teach an entire unit.
Within the last decade, the Northern Anishinaabe-Oski Education Council and Brock University of Ontario launched a collaborative effort to create a 5-year Bachelor's of Education program to prepare Aboriginal students to teach in their communities. Kitchen and Hodson studied the program, noting that it emphasized relational knowledge, whereby teacher-educators lived alongside Indigenous teacher candidates in lodges on reservations for 3-week intensive sessions. This aspect of the program was seen as successful in developing authentic personal relationships and helped to dissolve barriers between teacher-educators and students. It also allowed teacher-educators to get an idea of the local context and the challenges faced by the community. Additionally, the program emphasized continuous epistemic conversations between teacher education program staff, teacher candidates, and Anishinaabe Education Council, and the Tecumseh Center for Aboriginal Research and Education. Continuous communication around epistemic issues was seen as essential to developing teacher education knowledge. Before the initiation of the program, community members stressed the importance of Anishinaabe. However, only one of the teacher educators could speak Anishinaabe, and the lack of native-speaking teacher educators remains a substantial challenge. Participants that apply to the Northern Teacher Education Program come from 3 distinct groups of Indigenous people, the Dene, Cree, and Métis, who have not received equal treatment historically, and some have reaped more benefits from treaty negotiations than others. Therefore, not only is there a power relationship between the dominant non-Indigenous group and Indigenous students, but between the groups of Indigenous students based on their own racialized experiences. Because of these distinct groups, a theme presented in this program is cultural identity and cultural maintenance, both expressed in the interactions of students in the program and in the field-based structure of the program itself. The idea of Indian ways is unraveling as a result of dominance of Cree cultural and linguistic knowledge in education policy and curriculum as more Dene students enroll. NORTEP's collaborative structure allows for a variety of voices on a representative basis, a key part of a close cooperation between schools and school-related bodies, as well as employing a 2-week on, 1-week off structure as a unique delivery model to allow women in particular the flexibility for career changes and advancement while still managing family life. Aboriginal people were recognized by the Australian government as citizens in 1969, and with that came new rights and freedoms to come and go from reserves and access to health, housing, and education equivalent to other Australian citizens. In the 1970s, there was a push for opening teacher education programs to Aboriginal people and also developing university curriculum for non-Indigenous teacher candidates to access Aboriginal culture. The Aboriginal Rural Education Program was born out of the funds the government decided to sequester for improving access for Indigenous students to education. The main theme influencing this program discussed by Reid in her 2009 book is power, beginning with the government powers deciding to fund the program and dominant university powers deciding to relegate this part-time program to practically condemned campus facilities, and continuing through today where the majority of the teaching staff at RUPS is non-Indigenous. However, over time, interactions between students and academics created, through struggle, improving arrangements and the elimination of old structures which depended too heavily on individual goodwill and political orientation. Programs like RUP strive to acknowledge the historical realities of racialization and how that impacts Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students. In Bolivia, Puka Puka is a rural indigenous Quechua community with a long history of resistance to colonial rule. Worried that their children were losing their language and identity when they left the village to attend the public high school, the community started its own private high school in order to reinforce cultural identity. At the school, the government-trained teachers actively hindered the implementation of the Quechua language curriculum demanded by the community, believing that parents were denying their children access to opportunities. Therefore, the community trained and hired its own teachers, who came from the village, and would be more responsive to the community's educational goals. However, the Ministry of Education did not recognize these teachers, nor the diplomas of graduating students. The case of Puka Puka provides a salient example of the power struggle between communities, teachers, and government. Hawaii provides one of the most successful examples of Indigenous language revitalization, boasting the Kauaweola Indigenous Teacher Education Program, a unique program within the autonomous Hawaiian Language College at the University of Hawaii, Ilo. According to the Kua'aoege and Wilson, the low point of the Hawaiian language use occurred in 1980 when there were less than 50 children speakers. Hawaiian language and identity have since been dramatically revitalized due to a long process of structural change. The authors key in on the development of separate and autonomous structures, as they note that structures create identity and interaction between human beings as part of a social group, whereas the sole focus on content or curriculum is individual and can easily be circumscribed within the dominant language system. The Hawaiian Language College and the Teacher Training Program is an entirely Hawaiian language medium structure, in which everybody from teachers to accountants and administrators speak almost exclusively in Hawaiian. This required fundamental changes in everything from changing hiring policies and developing peer support networks between students to deliberately creating organizations and entities that would provide for language revitalization.
To make the important changes within society, and it's not just in First Nations community, everyone that calls this place home.
So that we want a fluent generation of Indigenous people, culturally fluent, linguistically fluent, socially fluent, because we're not done being human.
It's a way to give our future hope and to be able to build it from within our places.
There are both troubling and promising aspects of Indigenous teacher education and Indigenous education in general. The context of Indigenous peoples and the vitalities of their languages and cultures are greatly varied. Some communities have few elders that can speak the language, and it is nearly impossible to find teacher educators who do so. Other communities may have the wholehearted backing and participation of the people, yet lack the political power to implement the desired changes in education. In rare cases, Indigenous peoples may have both community organization, widespread involvement across diverse sectors, and access to political power, as the case of Hawaii. The future of Indigenous education may well depend on this type of cross-sector long-term collaboration. This seems to be a good recipe for success in linguistic and cultural revitalization, yet it is certainly not easy to achieve.